Liszt aged approximately 10 or 11. That's really typical of Czerny is sort of in one way, although to be fair, to hear some of his sonatas, you think is really there's qualities of Beethoven, Schumann, and Brahms. Even sort of at that stage, it's quite it's unbelievable. And as I said earlier, a critical appraisal of his works would be sort of well overdue. And let's hope that someone will do something about it fairly soon. I'm about to go on to someone else now. I'm not running through in any particular order, mind you, this evening, but I thought that would sort of well start the proceedings off. A composer whose name in this country is not very well known, Stanislaw Moniuszko, who was a Pole and earned himself the title of Father of Polish Opera. He was responsible for writing Polish national opera in the 1850s, 1860s. The most famous two, Halka and The Haunted Manor. So Moniuszko was so a product of Poland. He didn't really move outside of his own territory. But nevertheless, as nearly everyone else did in the 19th century, he came across Liszt. And even dedicated a set of 6 polonaises to Liszt in 1858. It was in fact in 1858 when Moniuszko left Poland for a 3-month travel through Europe. The only time he did that, apart from when he was studying in Berlin. Moniuszko was born in 1819 and died in 1872. And his piano music consists mainly of miniatures. There are 2 sets of polonaises, waltzes, mazurkas, and little small pieces. And also some transcriptions of pieces by other composers. And it was a set of 6 polonaises by the Polish nobleman Michal Oginski that Moniuszko dedicated to Liszt after having met up with Liszt in Weimar. Moniuszko apparently didn't have a lot of nice things to say about Liszt, believe it or not. He seemed to think that his piano playing was a disaster. And at that time, say in 1858, Liszt was staying at Weimar with Princess Liechtenstein, and Moniuszko had even worse things to say about her. The literal translation for the Polish doesn't really bear repeating here, but I'll leave that to your imagination. Nevertheless, he spent about a week or so at Weimar and played through a lot of 4-hand works with Liszt. And Liszt thought quite a lot of some of these little miniatures of Moniuszko. So I'd like to play the first one of these 6 polonaises by Moniuszko, transcriptions of Oginski, dedicated to Franz Liszt, 1858. think we can see from that, that is really typical of Moniuszko's piano style. Small miniatures, not intended for the concert platform as such, but he gets closer to the original idea of a polonaise, a slow Polish dance in 3/4 time. Of course, we all know what Chopin had done previously to that. Even if you go back to Chopin's early polonaises, they are not too far removed from Moniuszko in style. And now on to another composer who was to benefit from Liszt's influence, Joachim Raff, a Swiss composer who was born in 1822 and came from a poor family, and in the early 1840s wanted to get on as a musician, pianist, composer. So in 1843 he wrote to Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn, kind-hearted as he was, forwarded Raff's early composition attempts on to Breitkopf and Hartwell, a big Leipzig publisher, and upon Mendelssohn's recommendation they were published. And a few years after that, in fact in 1846, Raff met up with Liszt. I don't know, it's a little bit sort of difficult to try and work out what happened here. He met up with Liszt, and Liszt offered to take him on a concert tour, which Raff accepted. Then in 1846, Raff wanted to go back and study with Mendelssohn. Unfortunately, while he was on his way to see Mendelssohn, Mendelssohn died. So he went back to Liszt, and Liszt then recommended another publisher to Raff, another firm in Vienna. But as Raff was on his way to Vienna to see this publisher, he also died, so it was a very, very good start. But from that time, around the 1850s, Liszt employed Raff as a secretary, and Raff at that stage had acquired a superb knowledge of orchestration, and in fact was responsible for the orchestration of some of Liszt's symphonic poems which appeared in the 1850s. Raff as a composer was most prolific. Turned out 214 opus numbers, about 214 give or take, one or two here or there, including 12 symphonies rather, piano concerto, an opera, King Alfred, which incidentally Liszt wrote 2 transcriptions of, vast quantity of chamber music, vast quantity of piano music. But as far as the piano music is concerned, it does rather relate to Mendelssohn rather than Liszt. Although if one has a chance to hear any of Raff's orchestral music, there's much more of Liszt there than Mendelssohn. To just demonstrate Raff's piano style, one of his Slighter piano pieces, an Impromptu waltz, which was written about 1860 as far as I can ascertain. but Raff was not a composer to be trifled with. He did write some rather large-scale piano works, which there again also bear investigation today. There's a superb suite in D minor for piano, which does really lie in a mid-position between, say, Brahms and Liszt in piano writing. It's a tremendous work, and there are many others. The concerto is well worth listening to today, but unfortunately we don't seem to get the opportunity to hear some of these masterpieces from the mid-19th century. And now to another character who was rather, had a few strange stories relating to him. Adolf von Henselt, German virtuoso, almost contemporary of this. He was born in 1814 in Bavaria and died in 1889 or 1890, depending which calendar you use, because he moved to Russia, and the Russians had a peculiar calendar in use then, which sometimes means there's a difference of year if you go either by their calendar or the one we use here. Anyway, Henselt, he belonged to the group of pianist composers. He was active in Paris in the 1830s along with Chopin, Liszt, Mendelssohn, Hiller, Kalkbrenner, and many others. His peculiarity was that he had enormous hands. There seems to be some sort of divergence of opinion here as to what exactly he could sort of stretch with ease. Some people say he could get as far as, which is an octave at 6, which is absolutely ridiculous. Some say an octave in 4, but you have to read through all these contemporary accounts and try and go for yourself what this man could do. But whatever happened, he had the most enormous stretch, and as virtuoso music demanded, you had to sort of come up with the most difficult thing that you could at the time. He used enormous music, but not over so. It doesn't appear sort of merely as an excuse for putting it in. It does work, and it gives us an incredibly rich sound to some of his works. Even some of the smaller pieces, like Nocturnes, using these immensely large chords, give us in this rather rich harmony. It doesn't make his music very easy to play. 2 sets of grand concert studies, Opus 2 and Opus 5, they're bound in either large stretches or figurations which just cannot be got by unless you've got the most enormous hand. And in fact, when he went to Russia, he followed this tradition seemed to sort of follow through from him to people like Rachmaninoff, Scriabin, etc. Henselt was a rather peculiar character in that he didn't like playing in front of people. He could play to someone in a room, but if you get more than a few people together, he used to panic like mad, and his playing was absolutely abysmal, so contemporary critics say. There's a story about him playing a concerto, it might well have been his own. The orchestra had started up, the tutti opening passage, and Henselt was not on stage. There was a piano over the stall. And he was so petrified of facing the audience, he was waiting in the wings until 2 bars before his entry. He dashed onto the stage and landed on the stall, so he didn't have to sit there while the orchestra was playing, looking at the audience. That's how petrified he was of playing in public. So when Tsar Alexander II of Russia kindly asked him to go to Russia and teach at a young ladies' academy in St. Petersburg, he was very pleased. It means he now had opportunities, time to write music. He didn't have to sort of play in public to earn his living. But unfortunately, as a teacher, he didn't exactly go down very well. He used to get very irate. And there are stories of him conducting lessons, running around the room with a fly swat, swatting flies, wearing a red fez. So much from Adolf Henselt. But he did leave a number of very, very interesting piano pieces. Of course, there's a massive concerto, which is virtually unplayable, and these 2 sets of studies, and also this piece, entitled Poeme d'amour, which is an introduction and study in B major. This is Opus 3, presumably written in the early 1830s when he was in Paris with Liszt, Chopin, and the other lot. Now for another pianist of tremendous talent, the Liszt pupil, Karl Tausig, Polish gentleman, born in 1841, who showed exceptional promise as a child prodigy, which is unfortunately fulfilled because he died of typhoid at the age of 30. But if we read back to the 1870s to commentaries at that time, virtually everyone was of the opinion that this man Tausig was probably one of the greatest pianists that has ever lived. And Liszt seemed to think so as well. Wagner took Tausig in as a young man and looked after him for several years. And Liszt coached him in piano playing and composition. He left us a handful of compositions, some of which are unbelievably difficult. So, on themes, on the connection here, fantasy on themes from Moniuszko's Halka, which, well, I've never seen the like before. Looking through literally tens of thousands of scores from the music of this period, some of the things that the pianist was expected to do. And the one recording that is available today, the pianist kindly uses the easy version in many instances. There's also Hungarian Gypsy Airs Fantasy, which was recorded by one of the pianists back in the early years of the century. I'm just trying to think of his name. One of the Russian pianists put this piece up. There are 2 concert studies, and there are sets of Valse caprices on themes of Strauss, all remarkably inventive, obviously showing influence of Liszt, but some from the later examples showing Tausig out trying, I think, to be one better than his master. I think he almost succeeds. The Hungarian Gypsy Airs is as good as any of the Liszt Hungarian Rhapsodies, and some people might say probably superior in many respects, but that's not for me to say at this stage, so I'm not going to play it for you. I found this little piece called Nocturne Valse, L'Espérance, Opus 3. As far as I can find out, Tausig produced 5 opus numbers, which is not an awful lot. And supposedly there is a piano concerto, although it was never published. And I don't know where the hell it is. I'd like to find it, but there we go. Karl Tausig, Nocturne, Opus 3.
nationality? German?
Polish.
Polish, Tausig.
Karl Tausig.
Amazing, isn't it?
Yes, born Warsaw 1841. And now to another Pole who is one of my particular favourites. And another two little interesting stories here, one connected with this, one not, I'm afraid. It's Franz Scharwenka, born in 1850. And he is really today remembered for one work only. And that's a little Polish dance in E-flat minor, which really was it was one of the biggest pop boilers of all time. It ranks alongside Rachmaninoff's C-sharp minor prelude, Sinding's Rustle of Spring. He was a one-work composer. Great Scharwenka, Polish dance in E-flat minor, and it was a very early piece. It's Opus 3, number 1. It was written in the early 1870s, and Scharwenka had just written a violin sonata and piano trio. But it caught on immediately. Everyone wanted to play it. It's rather in the mould of Chopin. It's not quite the same. In fact, Scharwenka was to go on sort of be influenced by Schumann more than anyone else. But it enabled him to meet Liszt in the following manner. As you can imagine, in the 1870s, Liszt was being pestered left, right and centre by anyone who played the piano, because they all wanted to say, I actually spoke to, taught by, etc., etc. You can imagine what it was like. So wherever Liszt was staying, he entrusted his security, if you like, to this doorman, particular residence. Can't remember which town he was staying in, but Scharwenka particularly wanted to go and see him. And Liszt had already said, at some stage previous to that he would be very keen to meet the composer of this Polish dance. So, Scharwenka goes along to Liszt's residence, and his doorman refuses to let him in, considering that he's another one of many who are absolutely useless, who are just wasting his master's time. But Scharwenka had the foresight to realise that something like this might have happened. So what he'd done, he got the first few bars of the Polish dance in E-flat minor and pasted it on the inside of his top hat. So he handed his top hat over to the servant and said, please take this up to Master Franz Liszt. And Liszt came running down the stairs and invited him in. So it's very useful he'd written such a very popular piece at such a time. Scharwenka was to live on until 1924. He made gramophone records about 1910, and his output, mainly for the piano, includes 4 piano concertos, a symphony, an opera, various chamber works, and a massive amount of piano music, including approximately 35-40 Polish dances, which are mainly sort of mazurka-like pieces. As I say, a lot of his other piano music seems to sort of derive more from Schumann than anyone else, and I hope this is illustrated by this piece I'm about to play now. This piece called Novellette Op22 by Xavier Scharwenka. Incidentally, Scharwenka had a brother called Philip, who wrote 4 symphonies and hundreds of piano pieces. So don't get the two confused. This is Xavier, X-A-V-E-R. two composers who neither were pupils of Liszt, but well, one of them came into contact with him a lot during his early years, and his name must surely be familiar to anyone who studied that period. Sigismund Thalberg, of the duel fame. The duel with Liszt, the pianistic duel, where they each try to literally outplay each other in their virtuosity. They were so different though in their virtuosity. Thalberg's approach to the keyboard was exactly opposite to Liszt. Wasn't flamboyant, he didn't throw himself all over the place. He just sat there sort of calmly, playing as if nothing else was going on, but sort of making the piano do incredible things. And one of his sort of hallmarks at that time, the supposedly new innovation, although it can be traced back to some of his predecessors, was the so-called three-handed effect, where the melody line was quite often split between the thumbs of the two hands, while the outer parts were being played, and often a whole lot was switched around, so it had the effect of three things going on at the same time. It does work. Listening, if you can actually play this music, it does actually work. It does come over. Thalberg's output, for the most part, of course, took the form of fantasies and opera themes, although they're probably some of the finest operatic fantasies, together with those of Liszt, ever written. They're very inventive. He presents the themes in a remarkable, clear way. One of another hallmark of Thalberg's playing was his touch, his singing tone, which he always brought out. If it happened to be there, sort of in the middle of everything, you could still hear it. And a lot of people consider Thalberg as a far better pianist than Liszt. If today we could see the two of them side by side, I think there would be no doubt as to who would come off as the pianist, and the other one would probably be laughed off. But, you know, even when they had this duel back in the 1830s, there were conflicting reports that came out. One person reckoned that Liszt won hands down, and someone else reckoned the result went the other way. No one will really know, but both had their followers, and Thalberg must have been a fine pianist. And when he was writing original music, he seemed to have something rather individual to say. I'm very pleased that I was able to find a copy of his piano sonata, which was written in 1845. There again, there are conflicting reports of this. To bring out a piano sonata in 1845 wasn't perhaps a brilliant idea. No one really was writing sonatas at the time. But there's the Chopin B minor. There's virtually nothing else. They're still recovering from that sort of early 19th century outburst of fantasies. And Schumann and company were just taking over, writing more seriously. But no one was writing sonatas at all then. So this comes as a rather surprise, especially from Thalberg, who had written about 40 operatic fantasies beforehand. But nevertheless, it's a very fine work. 4 movements, fairly formal in structure. But when I heard it for the first time, about 8 years ago now, I determined to get hold of the copy and play it, because I felt it is a piece very representative of that period and original. It ought to be played on the concert platform today. So I thought you might like to hear the first movement of this Sonata in C minor, Opus 56. That's if the piano will let me finish it.
Are they from the beginning?
It's the first movement of the Thalberg. Thalberg Piano Sonata. It's a very difficult piece to play, not for the notes, but as I mentioned earlier with Henselt, Thalberg must have the most enormous hands. Some of the stretches are just going on like that all the time, which you don't find in, okay, you find in Liszt, you find in that and off, but it's consistently, it's sort of relentless. And you tend to get worn out after a few pages of that. And to make, well, just to totally finish things off and to conclude, to introduce to you, you must surely know Anton Rubinstein. Now, I don't know whether this is a good idea to attempt to play this on this piano because it's not really suited to this work, but I shall try nevertheless. Famous piece of Rubinstein, not the Melody in F, but the Grand Concert Study in C major, Opus 23, number 2. Rubinstein came from Russia. In 1846, he wanted to study with Liszt, but for once, Liszt refused. Liszt didn't want to have anything to do with Rubinstein. Rubinstein had a rather formidable, name made for himself in Russia. He was supposed to be a tremendous pianist. He looked very much like Beethoven, and some people even suggested he was an illegitimate son of Beethoven. Rather difficult. He was born in 1830 and Beethoven died in 1827. Nevertheless, there was a canny resemblance between the two, and Rubinstein was a huge bear of a man, and he used to, as one critic said, he smote the piano mighty blows. You can see that from some of his piano writing. It's absolutely enormous. But there's a peculiar thing that turns up here. Henselt's music is full of these large stretches, and Rubinstein was reported to have commented when he saw what Henselt had written. He said, "We can forget these. No one can play these. They're based on an abnormal formation of the hand." Yet when you look at some of Rubinstein's music, it's 10 times worse. Perhaps, no, we don't know. But Liszt, on one of his rare occasions, he had turned down Rubinstein because he feared a rival here, and Rubinstein was a real candidate for Liszt's sort of supreme position virtuoso during the mid-19th century. And this piece surely shows it. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope I perhaps introduced you, some of those that went along in the 19th century, and really got to say, that's just a small handful. There are hundreds of composers. They're all the Liszt pupils of the later 19th century. People like Stavenhagen, Dalbert, Lamond, Sauer. There are hundreds and hundreds of pianists connected to this. He really held the 19th century in perspective, sort of with one main line, so everyone sort of came together there. Virtually everyone throughout the whole of the 19th century knew Liszt, or came across him sooner or later. Well, I hope you enjoy the rather hastily assembled collection of musical oddities from the 19th century. And down here at Hammerwood, as I say, we do try and specialise in performing some of these pieces, not only for piano, but chamber groups as well, and get some of the production of these things so people can hear music for the first time since it was written. That Czerny Polonaise, for instance, that probably hasn't been heard in this country since perhaps Master Liszt was playing. And there are literally millions of compositions like it. Obviously, not everything's up to the mark. Some of them are poor, some of them are much better. If you look at some of the well-known composers, if a piece is by, say, Mendelssohn or Mozart or someone like that, it doesn't have to be good. So long as it's got their name attached to it, it's going to be played. But then that covers up some of the real masterpieces, people like Czerny on his higher plane, and Thalberg, Piano Sonata, and many other pieces. And it really does bear investigation. It's a subject which hasn't really been looked into in any depth yet, although people are still trying to scratch on the surface. But let's hope that within the next sort of 10, 20 years, we may be able to investigate what was going on around Liszt in the 19th century.
Well, thank you very much, Martin. Let's hope that with the wonderful enthusiasm of people like you and others who are investigating the 19th century, that this will come about, that these people will get better known.
Well, we can hope. People always enjoy the music. Come here and other places where I've been involved in either getting someone else to do something or doing it myself. People are always enthusiastic about the repertoire, which I try and get hold of and perform. It is worthwhile, and it does have an appeal to audiences, which is sometimes even overlooked by concert fans of today.
Perhaps you could get the BBC to broadcast some of this music on Radio 3. I mean,
Well, they do bits and pieces, but they're a long way behind, say, the continental radio stations. A friend of mine in Switzerland is turning on his tape recorder literally every day and recording something which has never been performed before, never been permitted to record before. Third piano concerto of Xavier Scharwenka was broadcast. About 8 of Raff's symphonies.
Yes.
And unfortunately, the BBC, for some reason, perhaps finance probably at the bottom of it, just scratch on the surface. Occasionally we get something. Fortunately, Tony Fries-Green did have a lot to do with producing some Raff bicentenary concerts in 1982. Also Ferdinand Ries in 1984 and Spohr. And one of his successors has now embarked upon this campaign to hear all the Sterndale Bennett piano concertos. But it's just sort of rather fragmentary sort of research and nothing in any cohesive pattern.
Ries is a composer you're particularly keen on,
Yes.
is that right? That you
There is a Ferdinand Ries Society which exists now, which is really there to take care of the early 19th century piano scene, look after people like Czerny, Moscheles and Ferdinand Ries, just before this period, in fact. That is run by
Where do you
Czerny.
scour for original scores? In this country, you're going to the continent, because you see, I lived in Weimar, I studied at Leipzig, I survived Dresden, and we went to Bayreuth not so long ago, and of course, we got pictures of father-in-law's grave. You know, he's buried in the musical cemetery, unlike Wagner, who was buried in his back garden. We have the photos here. So, you know, if you go to central, comprise central Germany, between Coburg and then go into Thuringia and Saxony, I'm sure you would find far more pieces there than anywhere else, because this is where all the strings led together, where it all came together during the 19th century.
Yes.
You know, practically all roads led from not just Budapest and Vienna and Berlin, but from France, from Italy. They all came together in central Germany. And that is really a hotbed.
Well, I would hope it would be.
Well, Wiesbaden, of course, is good for publishing. I would believe that too.
What has happened, in effect, that obviously, as the music has gone out of print, and let's face it, the majority of 19th century music went out of print after World War I.
Yes.
What happened then, of course, you're probably aware.
I feel sure you would get some in Weimar or in Leipzig.
But
Because they used to keep 3 copies of each that was ever composed or produced in Leipzig and Berlin. And Berlin was more destroyed than Leipzig, you know.
well, Leipzig, Breitkopf and Havel were bombed during the war. And all
Well, not too bad. I lived there. Yes. Anyhow, as I say, few people make the trek, but it is so worthwhile.
well, I'm always willing to try it because
Weimar and Leipzig.
it is worth it. There are things I need to lay my hands on. Things that I wanted to present to you some music by this pupil Sophie Mentor this evening, but extensive inquiries in this country have produced absolutely nothing.
Yes, well,
There is a piano roll in existence made by a young Claudia Raff about 1920 at one of her grand concert halls for piano. I've heard it over at the Piano Museum over at Brentford.
But she didn't compose very much, did
She
she?
wrote a fair number of pieces,
Did she?
up to about Opus 40.
Really?
Well, I've got a catalogue of one of the German publishers. I think it's, I haven't got it with me, Schlesinger, I think. They quote Opus numbers in the 30s. But no one knows anything about it. It's all sort of
Well, I
hidden
knew
there.
she was a fine pianist, but I heard that she didn't compose very much.
Well, the waltz that I heard, I particularly wanted to get my hands on, but no one that I know has got it. I know 2 people that have the piano roll. And
Yes.
obviously you've got to sit there with a piece of manuscript paper and copy out from the notes as they go down.
I think you might be able to get it in Russia because she played a lot for Tchaikovsky, didn't she?
It's a question of what happens to the large libraries and collections that include music like that. Sort of throughout this century, they've gradually sort of been absorbed into larger collections. And those collections, if someone has died, they've been sold off and then they come up into the hands of the music dealers.
Yes.
well, you see, some Bach works ended up in Leningrad. Butter was wrapped into them. You know, I mean, one of his sons, he got into debt. Eastern Europe is really where one must head if one wants to find original pieces.
Well, I hope I might be able to find something. I'm still making inquiries, and hopefully in a year's time I should be able to present an all Sophie Mentor evening.
There is an incredible quantity of this music in the British Library, early 19th century, perfectly incredible. I mean, people like Dreischer and Eastick and Neukomm, Hugenheisen, a vast quantity, millions of it. And practically the whole of Thalberg is there.
Yes, Thalberg is a little easier to find up now.
It is perhaps worth mentioning that Thalberg's opus numbers go to 83. And there are about 24 unnumbered works and 2 operas. And roughly speaking, about 2/3 of his output are these operette fantasies.
Yes, that's right.
And 1/3 are sort of pure music, including trio
Piano concerto.
and concerto, piece for horn, orchestra, and so on. But roughly 2/3 and 1/3 is the.
Going back to Thalberg, I'm sure that a lot of people would agree that when he is being creative, in other words, using his own material, he has quite a lot to say.
Yes, well, of course we got Telemann as opposed to Bach, but Bach had more children, didn't he?
The impression about Thalberg is that he was a fine pianist, but the general impression is, I think, isn't it, that he was a fine pianist, but he only played his own works.
He didn't compose for posterity. I mean, he composed to play at the time.
Well, one would say the operatic fantasies should fall into that category, but then those of Liszt should also fall into that category to a certain extent. But because Liszt is Liszt and his name is well known today, it goes back to the argument I was saying earlier. An absolutely abysmal piece of Mozart was discovered. We get all the publicity, we don't because the name is there.
But doesn't that reflect the conservative and unadventurous tastes of the general public?
It does, but unfortunately there are people that will go to some things like this, but you've got to persuade someone to put them on, and they've got to put the money out to finance it. And they're all rather cagey, they don't want to risk losing anything at all. very difficult. It really needs sort of every enthusiast to get together, try and sort of, all together. These societies that are springing up now, if everyone could sort of draw together perhaps once a year in London, and we could sort of pull out resources, have something good might come of it. It would be nice to hear a concert, say, of Liszt, and say, well, obviously